The Korean Mafia boss accidentally opened his maid's bathroom door. What he saw on her body changed. Some doors are never meant to be opened. Not because of what's behind them, but because of what you become the moment you see the truth standing on the other side, dripping water onto your marble floor, wearing scars that belong to your worst enemy. Before we begin this shocking story, make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our most intense mafia dramas and unbelievable secrets. Tonight's story begins with a simple mistake. A door opened at the wrong moment, and a discovery that changed a powerful man's life forever. Park Jun-suk had a rule about sleeping. He did it between 2 and 6 in the morning, for hours precisely, like a man filing a tax return. Efficiently, joylessly, and with absolutely no intention of enjoying the process. He had maintained this schedule for 11 years. His body had accepted it the way a prisoner accepts a cell. Not happily, but without further argument. So when sleep refused to show up at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in late November, Jun-suk treated it the way he treated everything that failed to perform as expected. He fired it immediately and got up. His mansion in Songbuk-dong was the kind of place that looked different at night. During the day, it was controlled, crisp and ordered. Every surface reflecting the exact image he wanted the world to see. But at 2 in the morning, with the staff asleep and the security cameras blinking their patient red eyes in the dark, the mansion breathed differently. Hallways stretched longer. Shadows pooled in corners like water finding the lowest point. The whole building exhaled something old and tired and honest that it kept carefully hidden when people were watching. Jun-suk moved through it in a gray shirt and dark trousers, barefoot on the cold floors, carrying nothing. He had no destination. Restlessness did not require a map. He passed his study where a half-empty glass of barley tea sat on the desk beside a copy of Kim Seol-collected poems, a book he would deny owning to anyone who asked, and continued down the main corridor without stopping. He was not supposed to go toward the staff quarters. There was no rule against it technically. He owned the building. He owned every centimeter of floor he walked on. But there was an unspoken architecture to a household like his. Invisible walls built from protocol and hierarchy, and the very reasonable understanding that powerful men who wandered into their employees' private spaces at 2 in the morning were either up to something terrible or had completely lost the plot. Jun-suk was simply a man who had lost the plot tonight. Nothing more sinister than that. The staff corridor was narrow and dim, lit by small yellow lights set low in the baseboards. A design choice he had never questioned because he had never been here at night before. It smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the kind of quiet that accumulates when working people finally stop working. 6 doors, all closed, all dark underneath, except one. A thin line of light ran along the bottom of the 3rd door on the left like a secret being poorly kept. The sound of running water came from behind it, soft and continuous. The kind of sound a tap makes when someone has been standing at a sink long enough to forget to turn it off. He knocked. Twice. Lightly. The professional courtesy of a man who had been in enough situations to know that surprises rarely ended well for anyone. Then, because there was no answer and the water kept running, he pushed the door open. What happened in the next 4 seconds would rearrange everything. The first second, the door swung inward. Steam drifted out into the hallway, warm and slightly disorienting, like walking into someone else's exhale. The second, Jun-suk registered the figure standing at the mirror. Kim Yuna, his maid, 26, 8 months employed. Excellent napkin folder. Her head was turned away, her dark hair damp against her neck, her reflection caught mid-thought in the mirror. A private expression, unguarded in the way faces only get when no one is supposed to be watching. The 3rd second, she turned, saw him, gasped. A small sharp sound. She reached immediately for the towel folded on the rack beside her. The 4th second, before the towel arrived, Jun-suk saw her shoulder. And then he stopped being a man who could not sleep and became something else entirely. The scars ran from her left shoulder down along her side, pale against her skin, thin but deliberate, the kind that do not come. She had not planned to tell him anything. That was the first thing Yuna thought as the words began leaving her mouth, slow and careful at first, like prisoners testing the door before walking out. She had been trained for exactly this kind of situation. Stay calm. Deflect. Manufacture a story plausible enough to fill the silence and send the other person away satisfied with nothing. She had done it dozens of times before, in rooms far more dangerous than this one, with people far less perceptive than Park Jun-suk. But there was something about the way he asked. Not the words themselves. The words were simple enough. Who did this to you? For words. Clean. Direct. The kind of question that could mean anything depending on the mouth it came from. From most men, it would have landed as an intrusion, a territorial claim dressed up as concern, the verbal equivalent of someone picking up an object that did not belong to them and turning it over in their hands without permission. From Jun-suk, it landed differently. It landed like someone setting down a heavy thing they had been carrying across a long distance, placing it carefully on the table between them, and saying, without drama, "Here. I see it. What do we do now?" She hated that. She was deeply, professionally annoyed by how much she hated that. She told him about Busan first. 3 years ago, the CO organization had sent her to retrieve a financial document from a black-tied courier, a routine extraction that had been planned down to the last detail by people who, as it turned out, had planned it using information that was already 3 days old. By the time Yuna arrived at the designated location, a cold parking structure on the edge of Haeundae, the black tide was already there. Not the courier. The enforcement unit. 5 men. One of them was Oh Taeyong. She described him the way you describe a weather event. Not with emotion, but with precision, because precision was the only way to be accurate about something that large and that destructive. Oh Taeyong was the black tide's head enforcer, a man built like an argument nobody had ever won, with small flat eyes that registered other people the way a calculator registers numbers, useful only for what could be extracted from them. She had fought. She was good at fighting. Years of field work had made her body fluent in the language of survival. She had gotten out. But before she cleared the exit, Taeyong had caught her arm, and he had pressed the brand against her shoulder with something small and heated that she never saw clearly because she was already moving, already screaming, already burning. She had driven herself to a private clinic with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed against the wound, and she had sat in that parking lot for 11 minutes after she arrived before she could make herself open the car door. Jun-suk listened to all of this without moving. He stood in the doorway of the small bathroom with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in an expression she could not entirely read, which was itself unusual. She was very good at reading faces. She had built her career on it. His face was the first one in years that gave her only part of the information and kept the rest locked away somewhere she did not have the key to. When she finished, the water was still running in the sink. Neither of them had moved to turn it off, as though the sound of it was doing some necessary work in a room, filling the space that silence would have made unbearable. Jun-suk looked at the mark on her shoulder for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice had changed slightly. It was still calm. But underneath the calm, there was something moving the way you can see current moving beneath still water, if you look at it from the right angle. He said, "I have been looking for Oh Taeyong for 14 months. Yuna blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. She had prepared for suspicion, interrogation, the cold executive machinery of a man processing a security threat. She had not prepared for this particular sentence delivered in that particular voice. She said, "Why?" And he told her about his brother. Park Jun-ho had been 29 years old. He had been the kind of person who existed as a direct contradiction to everything his older brother represented, loud where Jun-suk was quiet, open where Jun-suk was sealed, the type of man who remembered the names of every waiter who ever served him and asked about their families the next time he came back. He had been trying to leave Seoul. He had been building something small and honest in Incheon, a private consulting business, the legitimate kind, the kind their mother had always wanted one of her sons to have. The black tide had killed him on a Tuesday evening in October, 2 years ago. They ran his car off the road on the coastal highway and left him at the bottom of a ravine and sent white chrysanthemums to the funeral with no card because they did not need to sign their work. Everyone who needed to know already knew. Jun-suk's voice did not break when he said this. But something around the edges of it changed shape, the way metal changes shape under sustained heat, without ever quite melting. Yuna stood very still. She was recalculating everything. Because she had been sent here to steal a ledger from this man. She had spent 8 months inside his house treating him as a variable, an obstacle, a target with good taste in poetry and an inexplicable ability to make her forget, temporarily and inconveniently, that she was supposed to be using him. And now he was standing in front of her telling her that the people who had branded her skin like she was property had also taken the last person he loved. The water ran on softly in the sink. She thought about all the mission parameters she was currently violating simply by continuing this conversation. Then she thought about Oh Taeyong's small flat eyes in that parking structure in Busan. She made a decision. She said, I know where Taeyong operates out of now. I know his schedule. I know the name of every location the Black Tide uses in the Greater Seoul area, and I know which 3 of those locations they consider safe houses. Jun Suk looked at her. She said, and I know something else. Something about your brother that you do not know yet. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. He said, tell me. She said, not tonight. Tonight you need to decide whether you trust me. Because what I am about to tell you is going to change what you thought you knew about the last 2 years, and you cannot unknow it once you hear it. So, think carefully. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached past her and turned off the running water. He said, I will have tea made. Come to the study when you are ready. And then he left, pulling the door gently closed behind him, leaving her alone in the small bathroom with the mirror and the steam and the scar on her shoulder and the very large, very complicated problem of having just decided, for the first time in 4 years, to stop performing loyalty to people who had never performed it back. Baek Sung-jin had a theory about the mansion. He had worked in it for 19 years, longer than any other staff member, long enough to have watched 3 different interior designers come through and leave looking personally wounded, long enough to have memorized the exact sound each floorboard made at different temperatures, and long enough to know, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 2 decades paying attention to details nobody else considered worth paying attention to, that this house kept secrets the way old buildings do. Not deliberately, not maliciously, simply by existing long enough to absorb everything that happened inside its walls. He was thinking about this at 6:15 in the morning when he walked into the kitchen and found 2 empty teacups on the counter that had not been there when he went to bed. He picked one up, turned it over, set it down. Then he looked at the second one. 2 cups. Same pot, based on the shared residue at the bottom of the kettle sitting cold on the stove. Made sometime in the deep middle of the night by someone who knew where the good barley tea was kept, which narrowed it down considerably since Sung-jin kept the good barley tea in the back of the 3rd cabinet behind the cooking wines specifically because he was tired of the junior staff using it for their evening cups and pretending they had not. Only 2 people in this house knew where that tea was. Him and Park Jun-suk. Sung-jin put the cups in the sink, turned on the tap, and spent a long, thoughtful moment staring at the water running over the ceramic. Then he dried his hands, straightened his jacket, and made a decision that had served him well across 19 years of employment in a household where knowing less was frequently better for one's continued health and general peace of mind. He decided he had not seen the cups. He had not seen anything. He went to wake the cook. In the study, the morning had arrived with the reluctant gray quality of a Seoul November, light coming through the tall windows like it had somewhere better to be. Jun Suk was at his desk. He had not slept. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the yellow legal pad in front of him covered in handwriting, because Jun Suk did not handwrite things. He typed everything, or he said it aloud to people who typed it for him, because handwriting left evidence, and evidence was a liability, and liabilities were the one thing he did not collect. But last night had required handwriting. Last night had required the physical act of pressing pen to paper, because the things Yuna had told him in the study between 3 and 5 in the morning were too important and too dangerous to exist anywhere near a device with a network connection. She had talked for nearly 2 hours. She had started with the CO organization, calmly and without apparent shame, the way a surgeon describes a procedure, clinical and precise, because the facts were the facts and decorating them differently would not change their shape. She was an operative. She had been placed in his household to locate and photograph his encrypted ledger. She had been here for 8 months. She had not yet succeeded, partly due to the exceptional security of his filing systems and partly, she said this without looking at him, due to circumstances she had not anticipated when she accepted the assignment. He had not asked her to clarify what she meant by circumstances. He had written it down, though. Then she had told him about his brother. Junho, in the months before his death, had been doing something their mother did not know about and Jun-suk had not known about and apparently almost nobody had known about. He had been quietly gathering information on the Black Tide's financial operations. Not for his brother. Not for the underground. For a government contact, a junior prosecutor in the Financial Crimes Division named Ro Tae-jun, who had been building a case against the Black Tide for 3 years and who had needed an inside source who could move through legitimate business circles without triggering surveillance flags. Junho had been that source. He had been feeding Ro Tae-jun transaction records, shell company registrations, names of Black Tide members embedded in legitimate corporations for approximately 5 months before the Black Tide found out. The accident on the coastal highway was not an accident. It was a cleanup. Jun-suk had known it was a cleanup. He had spent 2 years knowing it was a cleanup. But what he had not known, what nobody had told him, what had been sitting in the dark like a piece of furniture in an unlit room that you walk into at speed, was that his brother had not been reckless, had not stumbled into the wrong situation through naivety or bad luck. Junho had chosen it. He had decided that someone in his family ought to do something that pointed in a different direction, and he had done it quietly and seriously and with full understanding of the risk, and he had been 29 years old, and he had managed 5 months before they caught up with him. Jun-suk had set his pen down at that point in the conversation. He had looked at the wall for approximately 45 seconds. Then he had picked the pen back up and asked Yuna how she knew this. She said because the CO organization had the same government contact. Ro Tae-jun was not as clean as he appeared. He had been feeding information in 2 directions simultaneously, to the Black Tide and away from them, playing both sides of a game that required him to occasionally sacrifice a piece to maintain the trust of each player. When the Black Tide asked him to identify their leak, Ro Tae-jun gave them Junho. The prosecutor had handed a 29-year-old man to his killers and then attended the funeral. Jun-suk looked at what he had written on the legal pad. Then he looked at the door of his study, which was closed, and beyond which he could hear the distant sounds of the house beginning its morning routines, the cook arriving, water running in the kitchen, the low hum of the mansion performing its daily performance of normalcy. He thought about Ro Tae-jun sending white chrysanthemums. He thought about whether the flowers had been the Black Tide's idea or the prosecutor's. He circled a name on the legal pad, pressed the pen down hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath it. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at the screen. It was a message from a number he recognized as belonging to the CO organization's communications network, routed through 2 proxy servers and delivered with a kind of casual confidence that comes from believing the recipient has no idea who is on the other end. The message said, "Progress report. Asset has had sufficient time. Deliver or be delivered." They were talking about Yuna. They were threatening her. Jun-suk looked at the message for a long time with the expression of a man who has just been handed one too many reasons to do something he was already planning to do. He set the phone face down on the desk. He picked up the legal pad, tore the top 3 pages free, folded them once, and placed them inside the cover of the Kim's Soul poetry collection on the edge of his desk, which was, he acknowledged privately, the most literary place he had ever hidden intelligence documents. Then he pressed the intercom button on his desk. When Sung-jin's voice came through, he said, "Please ask Yuna to come to the study before she begins her morning duties." There was a pause. Sung-jin said, "Of course, sir." Another pause, slightly longer than necessary. Then Sung-jin said, "Will you be requiring breakfast in the study this morning?" Jun-suk said, "Yes." 4-2. The silence on the other end of the intercom had a very specific texture to it. The texture of a 62-year-old man carefully, not drawing conclusions. Jun-suk released the button. He looked at the window and the gray Seoul morning pressing against the glass. 2 cups of tea in the night. Breakfast for 2 in the study. Somewhere in the city, Oh Taeyong was waking up inside a routine he believed was safe. Somewhere in this city, Ro Tae-jun was adjusting his tie and preparing to sit behind a government desk and perform justice for a living. and in a mansion on a hill in Songbukdong. The most feared man in Seoul's underground was rearranging his entire operation around a maid who had walked into his house to rob him and had ended up handing him everything he had spent 2 years looking for. Think about that for a moment. Think about the kind of loyalty that gets sold for convenience, the kind that puts a young man on a coastal highway and sends flowers to his mother afterward. If that disgusts you the way it should, hit like and subscribe right now. Only people who believe betrayal has no consequences will scroll past. The black tide is counting on your silence. Do not give it to them. The thing about living a double life was that it required an extraordinary amount of administrative effort that nobody ever acknowledged. Yuna had been managing 2 separate identities for 4 years, and she could say with complete authority that the logistical burden alone was enough to make a person seriously reconsider their career choices. There was the Yuna that the CO organization knew, sharp and mission-focused, and completely in control of every variable in her environment. And there was the Yuna that existed inside this mansion, the one who folded napkins into swans and remembered how everyone took their tea and had somehow, without planning or permission, begun to feel things she had no professional use for whatsoever. The walk from the staff quarters to Jun-suk's study that morning took approximately 2 minutes. She used every one of them to have a very serious argument with herself. The argument went as follows. She had talked too much last night. She had given him information that the CO organization would consider an act of treason if they ever found out, which they would, because organizations like the CO organization had long memories and longer reach, and absolutely no sense of humor about operatives who developed inconvenient loyalties to their targets. She had walked into a bathroom situation that was already compromising and had somehow made it significantly more compromising by sitting in a man's study until 5 in the morning drinking his good barley tea and telling him things she had never told anyone. She had done all of this because of the way he asked 4 words. "Who did this to you?" She reached the study door and stood outside it for 3 seconds doing what she privately called a face reset, the deliberate relaxation of every micro-expression, the careful arrangement of features into something that communicated calm competence, and absolutely nothing else. She knocked. He said, "Come in." The study looked different in morning light. Less like a room where someone recited poetry to himself in the dark and more like what it was supposed to be, the operational center of a man who ran a significant portion of Seoul's underground economy from behind a very tasteful desk. Files were stacked with geometric precision. 3 screens arranged in a slight arc. A whiteboard on the far wall covered in names and lines and circles that she had been trying to photograph for 6 months, without success. Jun-suk was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He was still in the same gray shirt from the night before, which meant he had not slept, which meant he had spent the hours between their conversation and now doing exactly what she expected him to do. Processing. Rebuilding. Reconstructing his entire understanding of the last 2 years around the new information she had given him, laying it out with the cold architectural precision of a man who did not permit himself the luxury of being overwhelmed. She understood that. She respected it in the professional sense. She found it deeply inconvenient in every other sense. He turned when he heard her close the door. He said, "Sit down." Then he said, "Please," as though the word had arrived slightly late, and he was apologetic about the delay. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the one that meant he was deciding not how much to say, but in what order to say it. He said, "The CO organization contacted me this morning." She went very still. He said, "They did not contact me directly. They contacted the number they believe belongs to a mid-level information broker I have used twice in the past 3 years. What they do not know is that I identified that broker as a CO affiliate 8 months ago and have been monitoring everything routed through that number since." He paused. "Since approximately the time you were hired." Yuna looked at him. She said, "You knew?" He said, "I knew someone had been placed. I did not know who. Your paperwork was genuinely excellent." He said this without sarcasm, which was almost worse than if he had said it with sarcasm because it meant it was a real compliment, and real compliments from this man apparently had the structural integrity of a physical object, something you could hold and examine and find unexpectedly heavy. She said, "How long have you known it was me specifically?" He said, 6 weeks. She thought about the last 6 weeks. She thought about every conversation. Every morning she had brought his tea. Every evening she had moved through this house performing the choreography of domestic invisibility. She thought about 3 Tuesdays ago when she had finally located what she believed was the external drive containing the ledger and had been within 40 minutes of accessing it before Sung Jin had called her to deal with a plumbing situation on the second floor that, she now strongly suspected, had not been an accident. She said, "The plumbing." He said nothing. But something at the corner of his mouth moved approximately 2 millimeters in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was clearly a close relative of one. She said, "That is genuinely impressive and also extremely irritating." He said, "Thank you." She said, "That was not entirely a compliment." He said, "I know." He sat down then, across the desk from her, and the dynamic in the room shifted slightly the way it does when two people stop performing for each other and agree without saying so to simply be in the same space honestly. He said, "The message this morning was a threat. They want the ledger within 72 hours, or they move to what they call the alternative resolution." She knew what the alternative resolution meant. It meant her, not the mission. Her. Operatives who failed to deliver were not reassigned. They were resolved. It was a clean word for something that was not clean at all, and the CO organization used it with the cheerful efficiency of people who had long since stopped noticing what it actually described. She said, "I am not going to pretend I am not concerned about that timeline." He said, "You do not need to be." She said, "With respect, the CO organization has significant resources, and I am currently in a position that could generously be described as exposed." He said, "With respect, you are sitting in the home of the person in Seoul who is most motivated to ensure that nothing happens to you before you finish telling me everything you know about the Black Tide and Ro Tae-jun." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "That is a very practical reason to keep me alive." He said, "Yes." A pause. He said, "It is not the only reason." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Seoul was beginning its morning in earnest. The distant sound of traffic building on the roads below the hill. The city assembling itself for another day of performing its various legitimate and illegitimate functions simultaneously, which was something Seoul was extraordinarily good at. Yuna thought about the CO organization. About 4 years of work performed with precision and professionalism for people who had just described her potential death as an alternative resolution. She thought about Oh Tae-young in that parking structure in Busan. She thought about Junho, 29 years old, driving along a coastal highway in October believing that what he was doing mattered, which it had, which it absolutely had, which was the most devastating thing about it. She thought about a man reading Kim Sol at 2 in the morning to an empty room. She made the second decision in less than 12 hours that had no basis in mission parameters whatsoever. She said, "Then I need to tell you about the ledger." He said, "I know what is in the ledger." She said, "You know what you put in it. You do not know what Junho added before he died." The silence that followed was different from every other silence in the conversation so far. It had weight and texture and a particular kind of pain moving through it that Jun-suk did not try to hide this time, and she found that she was glad he did not try because it meant he trusted her with it, which was a thing she had not been trusted with in a very long time. He said, "Tell me." So she did. The ledger lived behind a wall. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech designed to illustrate the emotional complexity of a man who kept his secrets close. Literally, physically, behind an actual wall in the east corridor of the mansion, inside a cavity between the original stone foundation and the drywall renovation that had been added in 2019, accessible only through a panel disguised as a decorative electrical housing that required a specific sequence of pressure points applied in a specific order to release. Jun-suk had designed the hiding place himself. He had told nobody about it. Not his security chief. Not Sung Jin. Not the renovation crew, who had been given a false architectural brief and had installed the panel believing it was exactly what it appeared to be. He had been, up until approximately 6 hours ago, extremely proud of this arrangement. He was slightly less proud of it now, standing in the east corridor with Yuna beside him, watching her press the third pressure point in the correct sequence without hesitation, her fingers moving with the calm familiarity of someone who had been practicing this particular combination on a replica panel for an unknown period of time. He said, "How?" She said, "The renovation crew." The CO organization had a contact in the company. They had the original architectural plans within 2 weeks of the renovation completing. She paused. I built the replica 6 months ago. I have been practicing in my room. He looked at the wall. He said, in your room. She said, behind the wardrobe. He thought about the 43 security cameras positioned throughout his mansion. He thought about the fact that not a single one of them covered the interior of the staff bedrooms because he was paranoid about security, but he was not the kind of man who put cameras in his employees' private spaces, and the CO organization had known that, had counted on it, had built their entire insertion strategy around the one gap in his surveillance that his own decency had created. He said, I need to have a conversation with myself later about the consequences of having principles. She said, I thought that was quite funny actually. He said, it was not meant to be funny. She said, I know. That is what made it funny. The panel released with a soft click. She stepped back and let him reach inside, which he recognized as a deliberate gesture, a choice to let this moment belong to him, and he appreciated it in a way he did not know how to say out loud, and so said nothing. The ledger was a black external drive, smaller than a paperback book, wrapped in a cloth sleeve. He had not opened it in 4 months. He carried it out into the corridor light and held it the way you hold something that contains more than its physical weight suggests. He said, you said Junho added something. She said yes. She said that according to the CO organization's intelligence, in the final 2 weeks of his life, Junho had made contact with a data security specialist and had remotely added an encrypted partition to the drive, a second layer sitting beneath the main ledger contents, password protected separately and invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. The CO organization had known about this partition for 8 months. It was the actual reason they had sent Yuna. Not the main ledger. The partition. Because their intelligence suggested the partition contained the complete documented evidence of Ro Taejun's double dealings, every communication, every transaction record, every name he had sold, and every payment he had received for selling them, assembled by a 29-year-old man who had apparently spent his last 2 weeks alive, making sure that if something happened to him, the truth would survive him. Junho had been 29 years old, and he had spent his last 2 weeks on Earth building something that would outlast him. Jun-suk stood in the east corridor of his mansion holding the drive and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. Yuna stood beside him and did not try to fill it. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality of something that had been through heat and come out changed on the other side. Not broken. Tempered. He said, the password. She said, I do not have it. The CO organization does not have it. That is the problem. That is why I have been here for 8 months. They believed the password was somewhere in this house, written down or stored in a secondary device, and they needed someone inside to find it. He said, and did you find it? She said, no. He looked at the drive. He said, I know what it is. She looked at him. He said, Junho used the same password for everything from the time he was 14 years old until the time he was 19, when I forced him to change it because it was the kind of password that would embarrass the entire family if anyone ever saw it. He paused. When I asked him what his new password was so I could help him with his computer if he needed it, he told me he had chosen something I would always know but would never guess. He said the password out loud. Quietly. It was the title of the Kim Sol poem their mother used to read to them when they were children. 4 words in Korean. Simple. Old. The kind of thing that exists at the exact intersection of personal history and literary reference that would mean everything to the right person and nothing to anyone else. Yuna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he knew you would find it. Jun-suk said, he knew I would find the drive eventually. He built the partition knowing I was the only person in the world who would know what to look for and what to use to open it. She said, he trusted you. He said, I did not deserve that. She said, you are here at 6 in the morning holding the thing he left you. I think that is precisely what he thought you would do. The east corridor was quiet. Pale morning light came through the window at the far end. Somewhere in the house, Sung-jin was beginning his daily management of the building's routines with the solemn dedication of a man who found genuine spiritual meaning in household logistics, which Yuna had always found both amusing and oddly moving. Jun-suk plugged the drive into a secured laptop he retrieved from a locked drawer in the nearby sitting room. He navigated to the partition. He typed the 4 words. The partition opened. What was inside was exactly what Yuna had described, and worse than either of them had fully prepared for. Ro Taejun's communications with the Black Tide spanned 31 months. The payments were documented in detail. The names he had sold were listed with dates. Junho's name was there, near the end of the document, with a date beside it that was 11 days before the accident on the coastal highway. There was also something else. A short text file sitting separately from the main document, labeled with a single word. The word was the older brother's name. Jun-suk opened it. It was a letter. Not long. Half a page. Written in the direct, undecorated style of a younger brother who had grown up watching an older one and had learned from that watching to say things plainly rather than dressing them up. It said that he was not sorry for what he had done. It said that he had understood the risk. It said that he hoped the drive would find its way to the right person, and that if it found its way to Jun-suk specifically, then he should know that it was not meant as a burden. It was meant as the one useful thing a younger brother could leave behind for a man who had spent his whole life carrying everything alone. It ended with 4 words. Stop reading poetry alone. Jun-suk closed the laptop. He sat for a moment in the sitting room with the pale morning light on the floor and the drive on the table and the letter existing now in his chest in a place where it would stay permanently, the way certain things do. Yuna sat across from him. She did not speak. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years learning how to read rooms, that this was not a moment that needed anything added to it. After a while, Jun-suk looked up. He said, "We have 72 hours before the CO organization expects a response." She said, "Yes." He said, "We're going to use them." She said, "I know." He said, "And after that." He left the sentence open. Unfinished. A door left ajar rather than pushed wide, because some things needed to be approached at the right speed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "After that we figure out the rest." He said, "That is not a plan." She said, "No. But it is a start." 72 hours was not a lot of time. It was enough time to sleep poorly twice, eat 3 meals you did not taste, and make approximately 47 decisions that could each individually end your life if you got them wrong. Jun-suk had operated in tighter windows. He had made bigger moves with less information and fewer resources and come out the other side intact, which was a sentence that applied to very few people in his profession and which he was aware could stop being true at any moment. But he had never before operated with the specific additional variable of a former enemy operative sitting across his planning table eating rice and kimchi at 7 in the morning with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided to be useful and was not going to let anything as inconvenient as the complete dismantling of her previous professional loyalties slow her down. Yuna was, he had concluded sometime around dawn, the most competent person he had ever been angry at. The plan had 3 parts. The first part belonged to Ro Taejun. The prosecutor operated on a schedule, so regular it was essentially a gift to anyone planning to move against him. He arrived at his office in the government complex in Gwanghwamun at 8:40 every morning, took lunch at the same restaurant on Tuesdays and Thursdays, left the office between 6 and 6:30, and spent his evenings at one of 2 locations depending on the day of the week. He had been doing this for 3 years. He had continued doing this because he believed, with the comfortable confidence of a man who had never been seriously threatened, that his arrangement with the Black Tide made him untouchable. The arrangement, as Yuna explained it, worked like a subscription service. Ro Taejun provided the Black Tide with advance notice of any government investigations that threatened their operations. In return, they provided him with financial deposits routed through 3 different shell companies, and more importantly, they provided him with the kind of protection that came from being too useful to harm. He was not, however, protected from the law. The partition on the drive contained 31 months of documented communications and transactions in a format that any competent prosecutor could present to a court, which was deeply ironic given that the person it would be presented against was himself a prosecutor, but justice had always had a sense of humor about these things. Jun-suk had a contact in the National Intelligence Service. Not a close contact. Not the kind of relationship built on trust or mutual respect. The kind built on the understanding that they each possessed information the other needed, and that this created a functional arrangement that both parties found useful and neither party found comfortable, which was exactly the right temperature for that kind of relationship. His name was Kwon Il-sung, and he answered his phone on the second ring even at 7 in the morning, which told you everything you needed to know about the kind of life he had chosen. Jun-suk told him he had documentation on a senior prosecutor involved in criminal facilitation. He did not explain where the documentation came from. Kwon did not ask. This was the beauty of their arrangement. Questions were the tax you paid on curiosity, and neither of them was in the business of paying unnecessary taxes. Kwon said he could have someone receive the documentation within 4 hours. Jun-suk said he would need confirmation of protective custody for a witness before the transfer. Kwon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Witness for what specifically?" Jun-suk said, "The black tide. All of it. Operations, personnel, locations, the coastal highway incident 2 years ago." The silence on the other end of the phone had a specific quality. It was the silence of a man doing rapid calculations about career implications and personal risk and the various ways a conversation could be officially denied if necessary. Then Kwon said, "I will need 2 hours." Jun-suk said, "You have one." He hung up and looked at Yuna across the table. She said, "The NIS." He said, "Yes." She said, "You trust them." He said, "I trust that they want the black tide gone more than they want to ask inconvenient questions about my methods. Those are different things, but they produce the same result." She considered this. Then she nodded in the way of someone who has spent enough time in gray areas to recognize a workable position when they see one. The second part of the plan belonged to Oh Taeyong. This part Jun-suk handled through his own network, the one that had been operating quietly and effectively for 12 years, the one that the black tide had always known existed, but had never been able to map completely because Jun-suk had built it specifically to resist mapping. 3 calls. 12 minutes total. Afterward, he set his phone down and told Yuna that Taeyong would be located within 6 hours and contained within 12. She said, "Contained." He said, "Alive. I need him to answer questions before anything else happens." She said, "And after the questions?" He said, "That depends on the answers." She said, "Fair enough." The third part of the plan belonged to the CO organization, and it was the most delicate of the 3 because it required something that the first 2 parts did not. It required performance. The CO organization was expecting a response within 72 hours. They were expecting either the ledger delivered through an agreed dead drop location or a communication from Yuna explaining the delay with sufficient credible detail to buy more time. What they were not expecting was for their best operative to have spent the previous night becoming the single greatest intelligence liability in their organizational history. Yuna drafted the message herself. Jun-suk read it over her shoulder. It was a masterpiece of controlled misdirection. It communicated urgency without panic, progress without completion, and a specific technical problem with the access sequence that would require an additional 48 hours to resolve. It was written in the exact style and vocabulary of someone who had been sending these kinds of operational updates for 4 years and knew precisely what level of detail was required to satisfy the receiving end without triggering suspicion. He said, "You're very good at lying." She said, "I was very good at it. I am currently experiencing some professional turbulence in that area." He said, "Because of last night." She said, "Because of the last 8 months, if I am being honest." Which, she added, "I appear to have decided to start being." He looked at her. She was looking at the message on the screen with the expression of someone taking stock of a very long distance they had traveled without quite noticing they were moving. He said, "For what it is worth." She looked at him. He said, "The turbulence. It is worth something. The direction you are turbulent toward." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the least poetic thing I have ever heard from a man who reads Kim's soul." He said, "I do not read Kim's soul." She said, "You absolutely read Kim's soul." He said nothing. But the thing at the corner of his mouth happened again, the almost smile that had been making brief, unauthorized appearances throughout the last 12 hours, and this time it stayed a fraction of a second longer than before, which was not nothing. She sent the message. The response came back in 4 minutes. Acknowledged. 48 hours. Do not fail again. She set the phone on the table. Outside, the window sole was in full operation now, the city running its usual parallel tracks of legitimate and illegitimate activity with the seamless efficiency that came from long practice. Somewhere in it, Ro Tae-jun was sitting behind his government desk performing justice. Somewhere in it, Oh Tae-yong was moving through a routine he believed was safe. Somewhere in it, the CO organization was managing its portfolio of corruptions and calling it strategic consulting. All of that was about to change. Jun-suk looked at the drive sitting on the table between them. Small, black, lighter than everything it contained. He said, "My brother spent his last 2 weeks building something that would outlast him." Eunice said, "Yes." He said, "I think it is time to use it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Together." The words sat in the room for a moment. Simple and direct, and carrying considerably more weight than its 2 syllables suggested. She looked at him for a long moment with the careful measuring expression of someone deciding how much of themselves to put into a single word. Then she said, "Together." 41 hours remained on the clock. They got to work. The thing about revenge was that it rarely looked the way you imagined it would. Jun-suk had spent 2 years building a picture in his mind of what it would feel like when the people responsible for Jun-ho's death finally faced consequences. In the picture, it was dramatic, definitive. A single sharp moment of reckoning that closed everything cleanly the way a door closes, final and audible and complete. What actually happened was a series of very ordinary-looking events that each contained an extraordinary amount of consequence. It started on a Wednesday morning at 8:37. Kwon Il-sung's team made contact with Ro Tae-jun at his regular table in the government complex cafeteria, where he was eating a breakfast of soft tofu soup and reading case notes with the serene, unbothered energy of a man who had never spent a single morning of his career genuinely afraid. 2 NIS officers sat down across from him. One placed a tablet on the table. On the tablet was a summary document drawn from the partition on the drive. Ro Tae-jun looked at it, and his face went through 5 distinct expressions in approximately 3 seconds, cycling from confusion through recognition through calculation through the specific variety of fear that comes not from physical threat but from the sudden understanding that the ground you have been standing on was never as solid as you believed. The 5th expression was the one where he reached for his phone. The officer on his left placed one hand gently over the phone before he could pick it up. She said, "That will not be necessary." Ro Tae-jun was in formal custody by 9:15. His office was being searched by 9:40. By 11 in the morning, 3 of the shell companies documented in Jun-ho's partition had been frozen, and 2 black-tied financial officers who had been embedded in legitimate investment firms for years were receiving unannounced visits from people with official identification and very serious expressions. Jun-suk received updates through Kwon at 30-minute intervals. He read each one at his desk with the focused attention of a man processing not just information, but the gradual dismantling of something that had been hurting him for 2 years. Eunice sat across the desk from him. She had been there since 6 in the morning. Sung-jin had stopped pretending not to notice and had simply begun delivering 2 breakfasts to the study without comment, with the quiet adaptability of a man who had lasted 19 years in a complicated household by understanding when a situation had moved past the point where his opinions were relevant. Oh Tae-yong was located at 11:43. He was in a commercial district in Maid'S, operating out of the back office of a dry cleaning business that served as a black-tied coordination point, which was either a deeply practical choice or the least self-aware irony in organized crime history given what the man did for a living. Jun-suk's people had eyes on the building by noon. The containment happened at 2 in the afternoon, cleanly and quickly, in the loading bay behind the building, with no casualties and minimal drama, which was not the way these things usually went, and which Jun-suk's team leader reported with audible surprise in his voice. When Jun-suk was told that Tae-yong was secured and asking a lot of questions he was not going to receive answers to, he set down the phone and was quiet for a moment. Yuna watched him. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I do not know yet. Ask me again later." She said, "I will." The questions happened in a location Jun-suk did not describe to anyone who did not need to know about it. He went alone, which Yuna argued against with the focused persistence of someone who had recently decided she had opinions about his personal safety and was not yet fully comfortable with how much she meant them. He said, "I need to do this part alone." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "1 hour. If I do not hear from you, I will do something extremely disruptive." He said, "I believe you." He was back in 50 minutes. He did not tell her everything that happened in that room, and she did not ask for everything, understanding with the instinct of someone who had done difficult things in private that some experiences needed to be processed in a person's own order and on their own timeline. What he did tell her was that Taeyong had confirmed the account of Junho's death in full detail. He had confirmed Ro Taejun's involvement. He had confirmed the names of 3 additional Black Tide senior figures who had ordered the operation. And he had provided, apparently with the resigned cooperation of a man who understood that his leverage had evaporated entirely, the location of the Black Tide's primary operational archive, a physical document store in a warehouse in Dabong that contained 12 years of records that the NIS had been trying to locate for the better part of a decade. Kwon Il-sung, when Jun-suk called him with the location, was quiet for so long that Jun-suk checked the connection. Then Kwon said, "I am going to pretend I do not need to know how you obtain this, and you are going to pretend you did not obtain it through methods that would complicate my career significantly if documented." Jun-suk said, "That seems reasonable." Kwon said, "The witness protection arrangement stands extended and upgraded given the scope of what has been provided." Jun-suk said, "I will convey that." He hung up and looked at Yuna. He said, "You have formal protection. NIS level. Extended." She looked at him steadily. She said, "And the CO organization?" He said, "That is a separate conversation that I have been preparing for longer than you have been in this house." He paused. They overextended themselves with this operation. They sent their best person in, and their best person decided not to come back. That creates a specific kind of problem for them that they will spend the next several months managing. During those months, certain things will happen that will make them significantly less capable of directing attention toward either of us. She said, "You have been building a case against them too." He said, "I have been building several cases against several people for a very long time. It turns out that running an intelligence network for 12 years produces a considerable amount of usable material, if you are patient enough." She said, "You are the most exhaustingly thorough person I have ever met." He said, "You built a replica security panel behind your wardrobe and practiced it for 6 months." She said, "That is completely different." He said, "It is exactly the same." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, the last layer of professional distance moving aside to reveal something quieter and more honest underneath, the face of a person who had been performing competence for so long that genuine ease had become unfamiliar and was now arriving slowly, tentatively, like a visitor who is not sure of their welcome. He said, "The CO organization will come for the ledger one more time before they accept that this particular operation is finished. When they do, I will be ready. You do not need to be involved in that part." She said, "I am already involved in every part." He said, "You do not owe me anything beyond what you have already given." She said, "I know that." She said, "I am not staying because I owe you anything." She paused. "I am staying because for the first time in 4 years, I am doing something that points in a direction I can actually respect. And because," she added with the careful precision of someone choosing words the way you choose steps on uncertain ground, "the man whose house this is reads Kim Sol to himself at 2 in the morning and pretends he does not, and I find that I am not finished being in the same building as him." The study was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the tall windows, the Seoul winter sun low and golden and completely indifferent to the significance of the moment it was illuminating. Jun-suk looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I read Kim Sol." She said, "I know." He said, "I am not going to apologize for it." She said, "I would be disappointed if you did." He stood up from the desk, crossed to the window, stood there for a moment looking at the city below the hill, Seoul in its late afternoon arrangement, complicated and layered, and full of people conducting their lives across every register from the deeply ordinary to the profoundly dangerous, often simultaneously. He said, "My brother told me to stop reading poetry alone." She said, "I remember." He said he was in most things correct. She stood up from her chair, walked to the window, stood beside him, not close enough to be a statement, close enough to be a choice, looking at the same city from the same hill at the same low golden light. Below them somewhere Ro Taejun was in a room answering questions he had spent 3 years believing he would never have to answer. Somewhere Oh Taeyong was discovering what it felt like to be on the side of a situation where the leverage belonged to someone else. Somewhere the black tide was beginning to feel the first tremors of a structural collapse that had been engineered quietly and patiently by a 29-year-old man who had decided that someone in his family ought to do something that pointed in a different direction. Junho had been right about that. He had been right about most things. Junsuk thought about his brother with a particular quality of grief that has moved past its sharpest edges and arrived somewhere that still hurts but hurts the way healed things hurt, an ache that reminds you it was real rather than a wound that insists you cannot move. He thought about white chrysanthemums and a coastal highway in October and a half-page letter sitting inside a password-protected partition waiting patiently for the right person to find it. He thought about the last 4 words. Stop reading poetry alone. He looked sideways at the woman standing beside him at the window. She was looking at the city with the calm, focused expression of someone who had recently made several irreversible decisions and had made peace with all of them. The late light was on her face. The scar on her shoulder was hidden beneath her sleeve, as it always was, but he knew it was there and she knew he knew, and that knowledge had become, in the space of 48 hours, something different from what it had been when he first saw it in a small bathroom at 2 in the morning. It had become shared. He said, "There's a restaurant in Insadong. Quiet. Good food. The kind of place that does not ask questions about the people who eat there." She said, "Are you asking me to dinner?" He said, "I am suggesting that we have spent the last 48 hours doing several extremely serious things, and that it might be reasonable to do one extremely ordinary thing before we begin whatever comes next." She said, "That is possibly the least romantic invitation I have ever received." He said, "I am not romantic." She said, "You keep a book of love poetry on your desk." He said nothing. She said, "I would like dinner." He said, "Good." She said, "And after dinner?" He said, "After dinner we figure out the rest." She recognized her own words coming back to her. She looked at him. He was looking at the city, but the corner of his mouth had done the thing it did, the almost smile that had been making appearances since the beginning of this, and which she had privately catalogued with more attention than was strictly professional. She said, "You remembered that." He said, "I remember most things." She said, "Yes. I am beginning to understand that about you." The city stretched below them, Seoul in its complexity, carrying its 10 million lives and its 10 million secrets and its 10 million quiet moments that nobody would ever document or remember, existing simply because they happened, because 2 people stood at a window at the end of a very long 48 hours and looked at the same light and decided, without making a formal announcement about it, that whatever came next they would face it in the same direction. Junho had left a letter inside a password-protected partition at the end of his life, and the last thing it said was stop reading poetry alone. His brother had listened. It only took 2 years and 1 accidentally opened bathroom door and a woman who had come to rob him and had ended up giving him something considerably more valuable than anything she could have stolen. The golden light faded slowly. Seoul carried on below. And in a mansion on a hill in Songbukdong, for the first time in a very long time, the study held 2 cups of tea and neither of them went cold. The end. If you have ever had someone underestimate you, use you, or treat your survival like an inconvenience to their plans, this story was for you. Junho built something true with his last breath. Yuna chose honesty over the organization that saw her as disposable. And Junsuk learned that the strongest walls are not the ones you build alone. Hit like if you believe loyalty should be earned and not assumed. Subscribe if you believe that the people who survive the worst things deserve to find something worth surviving for. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about what happens when 2 broken people decide to face the same direction, share this with them right now. Only the black tide walks away from this one. Everyone else stays.